So I'd like to start off by just asking you, does the MHRA still think that mesh is safe for use in pelvic surgery?
Let me start with that one. I, of course, remain concerned with all the stories that I hear from the women who've been harmed by the procedures, and they're very moving and very difficult stories. I think mesh still has a role in appropriate circumstances. It's not for everyone, and clearly it has to be part of an appropriate treatment pathway with properly informed, consented patients. I think we have to separate out urinary incontinence versus pelvic organ prolapse, and then the different sorts of prolapse, etc. But I think, as per the NICE guidance, it has a role in different treatment pathways. So yes, I think in appropriate circumstances, yes.
So the NICE guidance sort of has a hierarchy of treatments,
yes,
and it's the sort of last resort.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Well, I think clearly our role is at the product end, and then more broadly, NICE look at it in the context of other available options, etc. But I've got no reason to disagree with the NICE guidance. It's been something that's been very carefully thought through, but at least in terms of pelvic organ prolapse, it wouldn't be, the Prospect trial showed that results were, in terms of the beneficial outcomes, similar, whether it's native tissue repair versus mesh, but more complications for mesh. And therefore, based on that and the whole treatment process, the treatment guidance and looking at the whole pathway, I don't think it would be a first-line treatment for most conditions, but there will be people who will relapse after that first-line treatment, or for whom it doesn't work, or particularly complicated surgery. So I think it's still an option.
Right. Well, we do know that in New Zealand they've actually removed the supply of surgical mesh for the treatment of pelvic organs. Do you think that then the implementation of a single incision on the mini sling for the treatment of SUI?
Well,
because New Zealand seem to be having a different sort of policy than we do.
No.
And I'm sure you've been looking at it and discussing whether it's something you would wish to adopt or not.
Well, John, you may want to comment on the specifics, but what I would say is, since we became really aware of these issues, we've looked at this a whole number of times from 2010 onwards. We've provided you with the chronology of that. I don't think New Zealand have seen any evidence that we haven't seen. Right. But since 2010, the review, all the various reviews that have happened, our own review, the York report, the Senya report, the one we did for the Chief Medical Officer, the NHS England review, the Scotland review, NICE review, all come to broadly similar sorts of conclusions that in certain circumstances, as part of an appropriate treatment pathway, with appropriately trained people, with appropriate consent, there still is a role, and I think that still applies for mesh. John, is there anything specific?
I think Australia and New Zealand were in tandem on this, and the transvaginal prolapse repair route was viewed as not appropriate in their context. But you have to remember that they don't have a NICE who is able to support the limitations and the guidance on the use of the product. So perhaps they're in a slightly different position to the UK, where they didn't have obvious mechanisms for defining the constraints for the use of these products. They may have come to a different conclusion for different reasons.
Is there a similar situation with the USA? In terms of the USA, I understand also have different recommendations.
I think there are subtle differences in the USA in terms of what the FDA is putting out as guidance, but I'm not aware of any wholesale bans of any particular procedures in the USA.
I think it was just their decision to reclassify. That's right, much earlier. Sorry. So they came to a view much earlier that mesh should be reclassified as a Class 3 device. Much earlier than the Europeans.
Well, it was a Class 2B device in Europe, and I think the classification systems are slightly different. So, but yes,
based on the same evidence, presumably.
I think there's some evidence the FDA recognised this particular risk here and took measures to increase the risk management around that. The difference between 2B and 3 relative to American FDA 2 and 3 is not, well, is more significant difference between 2 and 3 in the US than 2B and 3 in Europe. But
while we're on the reclassification, I mean, it's something that very much surprised the medical profession and others, that the reclassification took place about a year after the mesh was first introduced. Now, do you not think that was quite a strange decision to have made, because there wasn't any evidence then of randomized control trials or the science you were talking about earlier on, and yet this reclassification was made from C to A, implying...
The reclassification.
Sorry?
The Cernip reclassification.
Yes.
Oh, right, sorry, yeah. I mean, the Cernip significantly predates me, and that was a voluntary mechanism that was put in place to look at interventional procedures, and I think that was subsequently superseded by the NICE interventional procedures program. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to comment on the processes that took place there, but it would be surprising that you would move substantially from one risk classification to another unless there was significant data to support that.
Well, it did surprise the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and other very important people in our world that that had happened, because they couldn't see any evidence of why the change was made.
And they were alarmed that the evidence that seemed to have determined it came from the industry. And so that raised questions of confidence. I mean, all of this, you know, is set out in the October edition of the BMJ.
Yes.
But if we go, can I just take you back a little? When you said New Zealand and Australia don't have the equivalent of NICE, so they don't necessarily have the same mechanisms for defining use and sort of treatment pathways. We do, but those, as you say, NICE wasn't in place when MESH was first introduced. So if you look back when MESH was first introduced, what mechanism was there for sort of determining its use? Because Cernip's clearly voluntary. And device regulation back then, I mean, we're talking sort of mid-90s, so it's relatively early. So could you put that in a little bit of context?
I think there's I mean, as I said earlier, the medical devices legislation, the first medical devices legislation that came into force in Europe was in the early 90s. There were sort of patchworks of activity done by individual authorities, but medical device regulations is in some respects in its relative infancy. So the processes that defined what constituted safe or unsafe use was largely left in the hands of the clinicians who chose to or not use the products. So the products were put on the market with evidence in those days which wouldn't satisfy current levels of requirements because the world's moved on, and certainly won't satisfy the requirements of the new legislation. But in reality, there were very few controls over how new products were introduced, and we've seen examples of where, you know, there have been, you know, far rather rapid introduction or adoption of new technologies which have not produced the results that have been expected, or have been adopted at a pace which is not consistent with training and learning in that process. So I think there's certainly something around the regulation of products and the management of introduction of new interventions safely, which requires some attention.
Yes, perhaps we could go on to that, because certainly the patient groups think it's very strange that risks were not actually explained to them. And today, earlier on this morning, we had a conversation about risks and the explanation now that is given to women. we hope that is actually happening within the service, because we're still getting grave concerns from the women that they're not being told exactly what the risks are. And in fact, with this insertion of mesh, very few of them are actually shown the tools that are going to be used, what they call the hooks, which are actually quite substantial pieces of metal that are inserted into them. And when they've seen that, they then have second thoughts. Is this a good idea? Now, it's the whole process that actually needs to be explained to them. They need to really see what is going to be inserted into their bodies. And in some cases, not at all. It's just a conversation from the surgeon who says, I can get rid of your incontinence very easily. This is a really good solution, and don't you agree it'd be a good idea? And women have told us that some of them were having physiotherapy that was working. And yet the surgeons were saying, you don't want to bother with all those exercises and things. This is the answer. Now, that sort of behaviour is really unacceptable. It is damaging. It is damaging people. And I'm just wondering where in your regulatory framework where you can influence that sort of behaviour.
Maybe I'll start, and John, you may want to comment. I mean, certainly with this whole issue since 2010, in our chronology, you've seen we've worked with the professional societies, we've worked with them in terms of information sheets to be given to patients, and the British Society of Urogynecological Surgeons and the AUS and have all got leaflets, etc. on their website, and are to be made available to patients. Our expectation is, it's very much the discussion we were having this morning. My expectation is that there's a proper discussion between the surgeon and the woman, that treatment pathways as per NICE, etc. Are followed, and it's a frank and honest discussion that weighs up the difficulty of the condition that the woman has, which can be significant, debilitating, and the risks of the options in terms of treatment, and the potential benefits, but also the risks as well. And I expect that's a conversation that should be taking place, absolutely. We have a part to play in that, in that we're regulating the product end of things, but and we'll work with the other bodies, but we're not the ones sitting there in front of the women, and the surgeons need to be having that conversation, absolutely.
I think we have a role, clearly, when adverse events happen. Manufacturers are obligated to report to us, and we want more and more clinicians and patients to report to us. But often the challenge we face is sifting out whether the product was the problem or there was a process or procedural problem. So, but I think we do have a role in surfacing the issues, as I think we have done historically in this area, to try and encourage the other parts of the system to take notice and act on what may be a problem for patients, and in this case clearly was for a significant number of patients.
Because, I mean, women feel that they are almost part of a trial. They talk about being guinea pigs, that they're just being used just to try out these new processes, new meshes, because, and we've had a debate, I'm sure, about innovation versus harm, etc. So, of course, we, as a society, we don't want to stop innovation, but we've got to make sure it's safe.
Yes. Yes.
And we really, what we've heard was that there wasn't really the research necessary to give women that confidence.
Well, it's clearly, as we've established, that some women have been harmed by these procedures. Each of these, that the device element did produce a package that was reviewed by a notified body. The regulations have moved on. We can talk about the new regulations, and that was deemed sufficient. And generally, I think goes up to about a year of follow-up. That sort of length of follow-up that was in some of the dossiers. I think I'm very sorry to hear that women feel that they are being treated like guinea pigs. That I think clearly we've got to learn from these messages. I think, as John has said, what is very clear is that we've got to, when new technologies are introduced in the health system, there's got to be appropriate monitoring, appropriate training of the people inserting these devices, appropriate vigilance reporting tools, etc., so it can all be done safely. I think that's clearly where we must get to.
But is a year's follow-up enough for a device that can go in for a lifetime?
Well, I think the challenge with all of this is at what point is it reasonable to introduce something, and then you've got to weigh up the condition the person is suffering from, the alternatives, how much distress they are suffering with the condition. What is reasonable to ask for prior to a CE marking in the case of devices, and what mechanisms are in place for appropriate follow-up afterwards.
So in terms of sort of weighing up and balancing, when does that process sit? I mean, what's your role as a regulator within that process?
For products to be put on the market, devices to be put on the market, they go to a notified body who will assess them, including the whole package, and issue a CE mark. We will then have a responsibility in the marketplace, but in the future legislation, part of the process will include a plan for monitoring the safety of the product in the marketplace, on top of the normal requirements that are there now for reporting.
What I'm trying to establish is, okay, you have a product,
yep.
You sit and you say, okay, we've done this, we've got this much clinical
Yes.
follow-up, we've got a year's worth of data. Is it the notified body that says, that's enough, that's sufficient, we think you've shown, you've demonstrated
Yes.
sufficient safety?
The notified bodies issued the CE mark at that
Yes.
point. Yes, that's correct.
So I mean, it's the notified body that does
Yes,
that.
that's correct.
No, I mean, I think what has shifted, I think historically, the amount of clinical evidence required to place products on the market was significantly less than it is now and will be in the future. That said, there's a clear need for post-market follow-up, structured post-market follow-up, because if you go back 10, 15 years, essentially post-market follow-up was we'll collect adverse events, and if we get a noise, a signal from that which says it's not working as we expected, we'll react to it. I think we are moving very rapidly, and the new legislation will accommodate that into an era where you say, well, that's not good enough. You actually have to have a structured post-market plan, and that needs to extend to the whole life of the product, because we've seen lots of examples where products are introduced into clinical practice, they work very well for a period and then they fail because this may be 10, 15 years down the line. So there's a balance between what is the appropriate amount of information that goes with putting the product on the market in the first place, and what you collect in due course. And you have to remember, I think, that these are typical engineering products, if you like, so that they do iterate, they do develop. So the products that were on the market 20, 25 years ago have almost no resemblance to some of the products that are on the market now. I'm thinking of things like pacemakers and the like. They're completely different. So there's a need to manage collection of long-term data prior to putting the thing on the market, with the need to get things into the market and developing from the knowledge of their use in clinical practice, which is what happens. So, and it's a difficult balance to strike. There are no hard and fast
But I do
rules
have to say, I mean, the patients that we've met, and we have met a great many in the course of this review, and there are patients who've had mesh inserted in the last few months. The moment they had the operation, they felt this excruciating pain. They knew things had gone wrong, and they have had great problems in trying to find surgeons who can take out the mesh. And when you're inserting it into this part of the body, of course, it's very, very vulnerable. You've got so many other organs around, and sometimes it's been badly inserted. And we've heard some detailed examples of why that has gone wrong. There are issues about the type of plastic, the polypropylene that's inserted, and the mesh. There is all sorts of questions about the whole way of dealing with this particular problem of incontinence. And I just, this isn't something that's historical. It's happening now.
Yes.
And we're getting the evidence from women who have recently had it inserted and are in a terrible condition. And as I say, trying to get it removed is not easy.
Well, from a product, we regulate the products, but in my mind, clearly, the implications of implanting products into people, which can't easily be removed, needs to be managed up front by the manufacturers to an extent. They need to be thinking about that in the long term, but certainly the clinical community and those who are placing the products into patients. There are in terms of implanting devices, it's my understanding, and you've had many submissions from eminent clinicians who can speak much more authoritatively about the clinical issues, and clearly there is a sort of profile post-operatively where things will surface quite quickly if the initial procedure hasn't worked well, and those need to be dealt with quickly. And then there are long-term issues that may surface, and I think that just plays into the need for effective long-term follow-up. Two things: one, effective long-term follow-up, and two, careful and managed introduction of new technologies, which I think sit in parallel with each other. In the introductory phase, there are two components as well. There's what the manufacturers are obliged to do, and then there's what the clinical community needs to do to support the safe, careful, managed introduction, so that you build confidence, if you like, in a new intervention over time on the basis of good data
what
about
the regulator
mechanisms.
does.
And what the regulator does. Yeah.
Or doesn't.
We have a role in looking at the manufacturer's responsibilities, looking at the data broadly to see that things are performing as they're expected to do, and if they're not, then we have an obligation to intervene.
I think it also comes to the appropriate discussion with the patient and with full insight as to the risks. The figures show that most women do derive benefit, but not all do, and the stories are the ones we've heard you're telling us about. But the appropriate consent, appropriate discussion of the risks, taking into account the condition and the suffering of the woman before she gets to thinking about surgery, the alternate treatments, etc. And then the provision of the service, the training of the surgeon, whether they're doing enough operations, etc. And if things go wrong, what the provisions are for looking after the woman afterwards.
But we do often hear the surgeon saying, this is the answer, this is the way, this will solve your problem, all the rest of it. And there isn't a proper explanation. There isn't what could go wrong. I know in this country there are some exceptionally good surgeons, and I absolutely appreciate that. But I have to say there are some that are so convinced of their own views that they are not expansive enough to women to tell them what could go wrong. And we hear that. We hear that now. This isn't history. This is what's happening now. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to go on to somebody much calmer than me.
Well,
sorry.
We've when we've met the National Institute of Clinical Excellence and NHS England, various things have come through. One is how long it's taken to recognise that there was a problem, because yes, you're right, 90% plus seem to have got benefit.
Yes.
What nobody seems to have appreciated until we met the women is just how terrible the suffering is for those where that is not the case. And so when the NICE responded to the BMJ article of last October, they said a systematic approach after our recommendations in 2005 could have identified more quickly and avoided many of the adverse outcomes of mesh. When Professor Willits gave evidence on behalf of NHS England, he said to him, so given all you've done, what would you say was could have been better? He said it was all too slow. it honestly took us meeting these families to actually go back and say, well, the recommendations of how to improve the service were actually sent round by the medical director of NHS England in 2012 and again in 2017. And here we are in 2018 and it's not happening. So we then went to the chief medical officer and eventually to NHS England and said to ministers saying, we think you should stop until such time as the things that need to be done, which are set out, have actually happened. And I have to say they've not happened yet. And we need to talk about that later on this afternoon maybe. But why has it taken so long? And who was in charge of it?
I asked myself, is there more that we could have done at an earlier time point? And then I look back to see what we have done. And when we started hearing about this in 2010, the Commissioning York Review, then all the other reports that we've been talking about to see the totality of the data, working with the various professional societies, etc., working with DH and all of this. I agree, it's taken a tremendous amount of time, and I would have liked to have seen considerably faster progress.
But why should we think it's going to be any better with the next sort of intervention? Which, I mean, NICE said to us, interventional procedures guidance aims to protect the safety of patients, and its recommendations should be seen as mandatory, not advisory. Well, what does mandatory mean if there's nobody who can make sure it is mandatory?
Well, I think this gets to the crux of some of the issues we were talking about this morning, how to join up the system such that if there's guidance, like the NICE guidance here, or something on valproate we were talking about this morning, where the system is mandated to take action or follow the guidance or deal
Who
with it.
can mandate it?
Well, I think this gets to the questions we were talking about earlier. Do you need some overarching safety committee that says henceforth it will be, or does a body like NHS Improvement have the power to say henceforth the health service will do? Or is there a patient
Will your
safety
role
system?
change in the future in a material way? In this instance, I understand what Mr. Wilkinson has been explained, but I mean, you're going to become a competent authority, aren't you?
We are.
You are.
the
So
competent
is that going to
authority.
change when the new regulations come in, so that you will have more capacity to
Well,
influence this?
I think our role is on the product end of things, but to continue to monitor, and if we continue to get lots of events coming in and hear the stories, then I think we still have the job of joining up with the rest of the system.
Is, in what way does it reflect the patient experience? We know that quite often success has been the clinical outcomes. You're no longer dry, no longer wet.
Yeah.
But it's not included the other outcome measures, the PROMs, the patient-related outcome measures, or the PREMs, the patient experience measures. So success, maybe success in terms of the primary aim, it's catastrophe for, in other ways. And so who picks that up? And is that within your surveillance, or is it somebody else? And if so, who?
Well, we still will be collecting safety data on an ongoing basis, and if we're still hearing about major safety concerns, despite all the actions the system is taking, then of course we will have a responsibility
But
to flag
they
that
never
in the system.
reported to you, or you didn't require from the system, the fact that there was pain,
We
or
do.
that they had dyspareunia. Or did you?
Yeah, well, no, I think there is, you're pointing to an interesting issue around the rules that sit under the regulation around reporting,
Yes.
and it's evident from the numbers of reports that come from manufacturers that the bad outcomes for patients aren't necessarily linked to the product per se, but are actually clinical practice issues. So the obligations of the manufacturers are to report incidents which involve, above a certain threshold of seriousness, but effectively that has to be linked to the performance of the product per se, and there's some grey in that interpretation, I would say.
In the reporting system that comes to you, the yellow card system, which we gather is going to be improved and digitalised, how would you pick up things that may be a concern to the patients, but not necessarily to the manufacturer?
If we had more patient reporting, would make a significant difference, and at the moment that's low, and we've, despite repeated efforts, we've increased the amount of patient and clinician reporting, but it still isn't at a level we would
I
like.
thought they were now the main cohort of the people who have reported to you.
Well, I'm talking in medical devices terms, then...
Can I explore that a bit further? Because
Yes.
it's my understanding that for medical devices as a whole, the main mandatory reporting comes in from the manufacturers. And that is your highest number of reports for medical devices overall.
Yeah.
And then you get the healthcare professionals, and below that you get the patients.
Correct.
When we look at mesh, pelvic mesh figures on the other hand, it's completely different.
Yes.
There is this reversal, the order is
Yeah.
completely different. So although the numbers aren't high, it's actually now the patients who are reporting more,
Yeah.
then the healthcare professionals, and at the bottom are the manufacturers. Now, is that because what the patients are reporting are the adverse outcomes of a procedure and how it's affected them, and the manufacturers are only looking at was there a fault in the product? Is it about that difference?
I think that is essentially the issue that you're alluding to here. And actually, when dealing with bad events, you need to look at them in the round, in my view. But as a product regulator, the manufacturers have particular obligations in relation to the performance of the product. They can't take responsibility for how people use them, although often we get useful signals from manufacturers' reports about usage issues, which we will use. But in reality,
it's partly linked to how the manufacturer markets the product. So if the manufacturer is persuasive, as they often are, that when they market their products, that in this case it is quotes, and it's been used, this phrase has been used many times in front of us, a gold standard product with a gold standard procedure. 30 minutes as opposed to an overnight hospital stay and so on. But think of the money your hospital can save. The manufacturer is using all these quite persuasive and on the face of it very credible arguments, then the result of that is that hospitals and individual clinicians are going to follow the manufacturer's line of thinking. They're just going to do it. So the manufacturer is creating a demand, not serving a demand.
I think it's true to say that manufacturers invest large amounts of money, I'm guessing, in producing products that resolve particular clinical issues, and therefore it's not unnatural that they would want to commercially exploit those. Equally, I think there is an obligation on all concerned, and a big part of our role is to ensure that the evidence that's put forward to support those products is consistent with the claims for their usage. And the manufacturers are obliged to describe the conditions under which the products should be used, but clearly it's a system issue in terms of what clinicians ultimately actually do with the products and how. So I think it comes back to this safe clinical guidelines, safe introduction and managing introduction. Historically, there might have been incentives to commercialise things as rapidly as possible because that's the way you've invested, you want to get a return on that investment. I think now that clearly is a flawed approach in many respects, and the introduction of new technology needs to be managed stage by stage so that the assumptions pre-market are reinforced post-market to a point out in the future, wherever that may be, where you say, actually, we are confident that this works as described.
Do you think manufacturers would agree with you? That way of doing things was.
I think increasingly the enlightened ones are. If you go to, if you look at some of the initiatives that are happening across the pond in the USA, it's certainly about long-term. It's about real-world data, which is a hackneyed term, but I think that's what it's about. It's about how do you collect effectively data, which reinforces your pre-market proposition or otherwise, but effectively ensures that the assumptions that you put the product on the market with are borne out in practice. And if they're not, you do something very rapidly to fix that.
So as the product regulator, how do you enable yourself to be confident that a product that is designed to go into the human body for a lifetime, at least a very long time, is inherently safe?
It's increasingly it's a combination of what's the data that supports putting it on the market in the first place, and what is the plan to manage it in terms of post-market.
Doesn't it come back to Baron's
That would not have been the case 10 years ago.
it comes back to Baroness Cumbridge's first question, doesn't it? Which is, it's kind of understandable that women, in the case of mesh, would feel like guinea pigs, because the only way in which you and the industry can understand whether this product is suitable for a lifetime in the human body is to put it in some human bodies and see what happens.
That applies to any intervention, whether it's
just
pharmaceutical or medical.
It's a fact of life, isn't it? So should the system, including every aspect of the system, the regulator, the manufacturer, the health professional, should the system not be a little bit clearer with people that this is the reality of innovation and medical progress?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think conversations I've had with patients have often surfaced the fact that they didn't realise that products are going to wear out. They do. Hips and knees don't have an infinite life cycle. Products do potentially change across the life, and those risks and the consequences of failures need to be played out very clearly to patients, because that's part of the risk-benefit equation that the patient needs to understand in managing the conditions and the potential interventions that can resolve those.
And when you authorise a product, to what extent do you take into account the difficulty of removing that product from the body? Should it be necessary?
I would say historically that's not been a focus of the regulatory system. I think it's been very much focused on a reasonable effect forward from the intervention, and some of the long-term impacts have not been fully continued. Actually, they're not fully understood in all cases, because clearly some patients are outliving their interventions in ways that perhaps weren't anticipated in the early days.
Do you think it should be part of the decision-making process?
I do, yeah, absolutely.
And under the new regulations, is that possible? Are you enabled to do that?
The new regulations are very much more specific about requirements around post-market clinical follow-up, and that's the old ones had words in that space, but it was just talking about collecting adverse incidents and reacting to those. This is a much more proactive issue, and I think it's very important that the long-term impact of these products on people is considered, and those are weighed up at the time of intervention, because and they are, in fact, in many cases. If you think about hip replacement, for instance, a lot of the sometimes less than successful innovation has been trying to manage this need to intervene with ever younger patients, but in the knowledge that hips, we just had some data last week, last 15, 20, 25 years. We're not, depending on where, but they don't last forever, and you don't have an infinite number of opportunities to revisit the operation in the first place.
If you're talking about a piece of polypropylene inside the pelvis,
yes,
which has been like, in terms of removal, has been likened by patients and by clinicians actually, when speaking to us, to removing chewing gum from the hair.
Yes.
Do you still think that there is a place for surgical mesh in pelvic procedures in the future?
We've consistently been advised by clinicians from a wide range of places that there is, and I think we have to go on the clinical advice we have. There are intractable problems for which mesh remains the most effective intervention. But so I have to go with the breadth of clinical opinion that I've received.
Can I just ask you, because as I understand it, when you're bringing a new medicine, a medication or whatever to the market, there's a huge amount of research that has to go on, and it takes about 9 years, something like that, from a sort of from the very beginning to the product on the market. Where does devices fit into that? Because it seems to me that they are the regulators or whoever are far less rigorous in ensuring that the device is safe.
Well, maybe I can pick up that a little bit, and then John, you might want to come in. Medical devices, of course, span anything from an elastoplast all the way through to mesh and hip, so very broad range of different things. The regulations are getting much more stringent with medical devices, requiring much more clinical data, before they get the CE mark, together with a plan of monitoring afterwards, plus additional pre-market scrutiny for the highest risk devices. So all of that will actually increase the requirements on device manufacturers to produce a larger dossier of evidence before a product is CE marked. So, clearly each device or each medicine has very different circumstances, etc., and it's got to be tailored to the circumstance. So I think it's right that the regulations, the new set of regulations, device regulations, are increasing the requirements, particularly for the more complicated and invasive devices. That's right that should happen. Devices are different things to medicines, of course. Devices continue to evolve, slightly change that. You can't do that with a medicine without having to go through a significant development program. And then it's a question of tailoring the needs to the circumstances and how different is it to something else. But the requirements are certainly going up for devices, perhaps more than they have been in the past. John, is there anything you want to add to that?
I don't think so. I think it's a balancing decision around risk, cost, a whole raft of issues relating to what constitutes a reasonable amount of evidence for placing the product on the market, and what constitutes effective follow-up. And I think it's difficult to define precisely. There's no generalities here, because some products are clearly very different from others in terms of the level of evidence that would be required and the consequences of getting it wrong, which is probably the most important component here.
The thing is that more regulation doesn't mean better regulation.
It doesn't, you're right.
And so the issues around variability and CE marking up till now has obviously been a problem. Do you have confidence that having more regulation will mean better, and that the means by which the governance arrangements and the process of getting the CE marking will actually improve the consequences?
The legislation has clearly learnt the lessons of 20-25 years of using the previous generation of legislation, but like all legal frameworks, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as it were. The implementation of that legislation will be critical to its success.
It's the variation in interpretation.
Perhaps I can come in just on this. I think if you're talking about the standard of the notified bodies, this is an issue that we have been addressing for a number of years. Following the breast implant issues, we pushed for the joint audit programme of the notified bodies. So it's not just a single competent authority inspecting their own notified bodies, but it's a broader, it's the Commission and two member states, another member state involved.
That's our routine.
Oh yes. And the notified body. So that's been in place for a number of years, and we've seen actually a drop off in the number of notified bodies from 80 odd to 50 or something. 50.
What did that mean for the devices that they CE mark?
Well, they're still in place, but
so hang on.
Perhaps I can. If a notified body ceases trading, there's a transition period. They have to find a new notified body, and so most
manufacturers would have
the manufacturer has to go and find a new notified body. The notified bodies of the recipients can either take on face value that the products has gone through the certification process. Most I would say all don't do that, because clearly they're taking responsibility. But I mean, legally the certificate can transfer to another notified body. In reality, the recipient notified bodies are fully reviewing those products, and we've seen post the introduction of the joint audits, we've seen a spike in the withdrawal of CE marks across Europe, which I would interpret as certificates being removed because the evidence didn't support the products.
And what proportion of those were class 3?
Any idea? I'm not sure I can answer you that, and I'm not sure whether I've got that data available, but probably relatively few, because most of the notified bodies that have gone out of business have been the smaller notified bodies, which would probably not be doing class 3 products. But
there's a lot of probably in that.
Well, there is, because I haven't got the data's not available.
That's one of the issues, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not holding a central register of what's actually on the market.
And can I also follow up with the new regulations, John? I think it's true to say that all the devices that are currently on the market have got to go through a recertification.
Yes.
And the notified bodies also got to go through a redesignation process as well.
Yeah. Historically, when you change in a lot of regulatory regimes, you go from one to another. There's a sort of grandfathering activity. There is no grandfathering in this. There's transitional arrangements, but no grandfathering. So every product that's currently on the market needs to go through a recertification to the new standards.
Is it right that notified bodies should continue to be commercial companies?
I'm not sure that's a question that I'm in a position to answer. They vary in reality from publicly owned bodies in certain member states. They're part of two organisations like BSI in the UK, which have a peculiar constitution as a sort of private body but with a public purpose, through to more commercial enterprises. They're all linked to conformity assessment bodies, standards bodies and the like, which in many sectors is deemed an appropriate way of approaching that, but ensuring that there's conformity and things are being put on the market in conformity with the legislation. If they're managed effectively, I'm not sure that there's an issue around whether they're in public ownership or private ownership. The issue is
obviously a question, or the issue that people have raised concerns about with us is the role of the profit motive.
Yeah.
So if the notified body is there to make a profit and be a successful business, it needs to attract custom. And to attract custom, it has to know and serve its customer. And its customer is manufacturers.
I think the question really is, rather than are they commercial enterprises, are they competent to do their job? And I think that has been the thrust of the joint audit programme, the whole recertification of notified bodies, etc., the inspections of notified bodies by the competent authorities across Europe to make sure that they're competent to do the job. And we talked earlier about the number of notified bodies reducing from 80 odd to 50. So
the fact that the profit motive is involved is not a concern to the MHRA?
The profit per se is not the issue, is whether they're competent to do their job and they do it entirely appropriately is the area we would focus on.
I want to turn now to the how. We discussed this morning the what. Now, one of the requirements that for releasing the pause, which was set out, is that surgeons report every procedure to a national database. Register operations is maintained to ensure every procedure is notified, and the woman identified has undergone surgery. So that is an agreed what, and it's been around for a long time. So what about the how? When we met the President of the Royal College of Surgeons and the President of the Royal College of Obstetricians, we put to them the notion that there was a difference between a national database and a registry. And as far as the database is concerned, we would propose that every time a surgeon completes an operation, as part of the operation note, which she or he always completes, that they would register a set of information which would include a device which has been inserted, maybe with scan for safety and a barcode, but whatever, and that would then be reported to a national database. In other words, the responsibility for creating the device would be on the person who did the operation, not a third-party code or whatever. And was that a reasonable proposal? And they said yes, they thought it was. And it's in line, incidentally, with what the College of Surgeons has said in the future of surgery. First question, and I've got three. The first one is, would you support that?
Absolutely, yes. I think there's evidence that coding is one of the critical areas, and clearly we see that in other jurisdictions. And accurate coding is one of the fundamental building blocks of anything that's going to work here. And the surgeon who's done the procedure is the best place to code the thing appropriately and correctly.
Right. My second question is, who would be responsible for creating this database? Would it be you, or would it be a new agency, which we discussed more than once during this session?
Do you want to talk about the discussions you've had in relation to
I think we've got a lot of experience of registries on the devices front, because particularly in the orthopaedic sector, because the National Joint Registry has been operating for a long time very successfully and very effectively, and has been a vital tool in allowing us to be the first regulators.
I'm talking about a database here, not a registry.
Ah, right, okay.
Because the database is the information which is, use the word mandated, I think, could be mandated under a legitimate reason in GDPR to be collected. The registry is what then interrogates the database with the complicated questions necessary, and that does, in my understanding, require quite properly patient participation in permission to do that. And it would also, I think, reasonably involve people who are expert in this area, be they Pelvic Floor Society, Bowels, and BSAT and so forth. So,
I don't think the responsibility for putting large databases together, covering a variety of interventions across the system, including those that involve drugs and devices or not, is the responsibility of the MHRA. We're a product regulator, essentially. So I think the need for us to be engaged in that process, with that process, and have access to certain aspects of the information that surfaces is absolutely critical. So I think we are a very interested party, but probably not really.
That leads to my third question.
Can I just come in on that? I think particularly if it could be linked with the patient notes, that would be the way, electronic patient notes properly coded, and then maybe a body like NHS Digital that can extract them from the patient notes would be the way to hold the data, and then to put on top of that the analytics around a registry.
There are certainly GDPR issues with that, which I'm not competent to discuss, because that gets near to using it as a register, and that does require the permission from the patients. But once you've got the database, you've got something which enables other people with permission that's appropriate to link to. And you are one of those people, which is my third question, which is, given your responsibility for seeing whether medicines and devices are safe in the short and the long and the infinite term, if you've got one inside you as I have, then would you be able then to construct, theoretically at any rate, a linkage system which can link the yellow card reporting system to the database, so that you could facilitate, I think, what you've just suggested, Dr. Hudson?
We would certainly want to look to do that. We currently hold CPRD within the MHRA, and we are exploring how we link yellow card data with CPRD to rapidly look at signals. June can maybe comment a bit more about that. So similarly, if we have a large collection of patient records effectively, or patient data, to be able to, with a signal, or even look at this database for, well, we need to think through the scientific merits of using it to confirm signals or not, that's a separate issue. But to somehow link the sort of generation of a signal somewhere with interrogating the database rapidly to evaluate it properly, absolutely, that's the direction we'd want to go. We already link CPRD with about 12, 15 different data sets, hospital episode statistics, a number of registry type data for epidemiological type purposes. June, do you want to comment about the work you've been doing?
Even to go a little step further is how to involve the patient voice, because if the patient is going to be asked, please will you give your permission for us to do studies, etc. But the app that we've produced, that we talked about for Yellow Card, we've got quite an interesting piece of work ongoing at the moment to link that data it's called application program interface work, but to link that in. So in an ideal world, the patient will be able to add their experiences and feel a real sense of ownership of the monitoring of the treatment or the intervention. So I think we start with simple questions, spontaneous data, and this exposure monitoring through a registry or database, and then build the registry so that that has an opportunity not just for regulatory decisions but for other important public health uses, as CPRD is.
Yes. I think the importance of a registry in this area, it deals with the product related aspects, but it also deals with clinical practice, gives you outcomes in relation to clinical practice, and I think both are important elements to be able to monitor in a register.
And I think our experiences of talking to people about registries and what's good and what's bad, we've done quite a lot of work. Clearly the governance around registries is important because the data needs to be available to patients, it needs to be available to manufacturers, it needs to be available to clinicians. There are a whole load of stakeholders that can benefit from the feedback loops that registry data allows them to use for the benefit of
we do a lot with anonymised data, and I think the law is pretty clear about that in practice now, but it's not quite so clear when you're using patient identifiable data of their immediate medical circumstances, and that's we have to go away and explore. But in principle, you're alongside what I've just been saying.
In principle, we would very much value richer data sources such as the one you've been describing to enable better decision making. Absolutely.
The other query alongside that is that obviously NHS data is linked into the NHS systems. Anything done in the private sector doesn't automatically. So in terms of devices, we've heard certainly a lot of mesh was done in the private sector first, because device availability, because of funding issues, is often there in the private sector first. Do you monitor sort of relative difference in usages between private and NHS, and do you sort of look at that data?
We don't have access to that sort of data, and I think
would it be helpful to?
I think it would be extreme. I think you have to consider the interests of patients in the round, not whether they've chosen to go into the private sector. And actually, I think obligations for data sharing, broadly speaking, between the NHS and the private sector should be similar.
Do you have any connection with FIN, the Private Health Information Network? I should declare an interest, by the way, I'm an executive director.
Right.
I don't think.
I'm not aware that we do. No.
I don't think.
Maybe outside the meeting.
Yes.
Right. Just because that's been raised, can I just ask you about the private sector? Because the private sector, of course, does a lot of work for the National Health Service. We just wondered, as you are the regulators, whether you analyse whether device implanting procedures are carried out at different rates in the NHS and in the private sector.
I don't know the answer to that. Do you?
I don't think we'd have access to any information. I mean, we have anecdotal information, but that's the best we can offer in these situations. So.
But you are the regulator also for the private sector.
We're the regulator for products that are used in the UK, whether they're used in the home, private hospital, or where. And increasingly, it's neither the private sector nor the public sector. It's actually in the home and the like. So I think we are responsible for the thing in the round, but that doesn't necessarily equate to us having good quality information about what goes on everywhere in the system.
Do you think you should be finding out some of that information?
I think it would be very helpful to understand whether there are differences in clinical practice that sit in the various places and differences in outcomes, and because clearly the risk profile to patients may be different according to the circumstances in which they're being managed, whether that be at home, in a hospital, or in a public hospital or a private hospital, or wherever else, in a nursing home.
Is there a body that can do that?
Yes, there is.
Right, well, he knows everything.
We'll talk about it afterwards. Okay. I mean, 45% of the activity, as we've learned in the private sector, is on NHS patients.
Yes. But I think there's a broader trend, which means that historically, traditionally, patients went to a hospital, they were managed by a consultant and they left. That's breaking down in many respects. Hospital stays are shorter, the amount of community care is changing, the sort of products that the industry's developing are actually reflecting that as well. So the risk profile of managing the system is changing, I would say.
Could I just go back to the discussion that Sir Cyril raised about databases? Bearing in mind your contact with working relationship with manufacturers, you might know they're thinking a bit better than we would. Do you think they would find databases of the kind that we've discussed just now helpful from their own perspective?
My belief is the forward-looking companies want the best available data about the performance of their products. Historically, they may not have, necessarily wanted to surface issues that, in a timely manner. I don't know, hard to say. But the forward-looking companies now realise that the consequences of long-term continuing failure of a product to them reputationally, financially, in every other respect, and clearly they don't generally set in business to damage patients, they're there to help patients. So my view is that it is in the interests of everybody to have good data and to act upon it in a timely manner, and that includes the industry. And I think they'd be hard pressed to say otherwise, and I don't think they would, from my experience.
Maybe I can add to that, John, to say I absolutely agree with all you've said, that clearly there are 20 device databases in the UK of different sorts already. There's a large number of medicines registry type things across Europe, and companies use them to address safety issues with their products. In June, you'll have seen through your various vigilance activities a lot of medicine companies producing medicines using databases to
yes, certainly the big shift, the new era, started with the requirement for companies to have in place a plan to fill in the uncertainties, to actually conduct studies that would answer the questions that largely are predictable, and to do so in a reasonable period of time. So that really has created a momentum, and again the European agency's been doing quite a lot of work about how to have visibility, the best model for a registry, and how to build interoperability. And just as many of these things build from the passion of health professionals, the biologics, for example, a marvellous registry in the UK, but others in other countries, can they provide an interoperable base so that when a safety question arises, I think one good example was when there's a question about brain tumour, for example, that you can get rapid answers rather than small snapshots. So this is now going to be the era of getting good data, robustly analysed, from real experience, which can be very different. However much we want good trial data, it is rather selected compared with the real world out there, and we always have to pay tribute to the extent that clinicians go to try and help their patient, even if perhaps the circumstances that patient's in are not quite ideal. So I think, yes, it's the future, and I think the companies who originally said when we introduced risk management plans, and I can quote from experience, this will be expensive, then reflected how expensive it is, not just in financial terms, but in human suffering, to have not enough data soon enough.
And it's worth putting on record that many of the clinical databases were established by clinicians who were trying to help patients, and quite often they've had to find funding themselves for the database. And I personally think it's time for the state to get much more involved in this and work with the clinical community and the patients to produce better systems.
I mean, one of the things worth identifying is one of the spin-offs of the National Joint Register was an initiative called Beyond Compliance, which, when it was set up, was beyond compliance, but arguably post-2020, when the new medical device regulations come in, it is just part of providing a service to be compliant. And that was really very much targeted at this early introduction, ensuring that products were introduced into the market to a selective number of clinicians who were properly trained and committed to feeding back. So the beyond compliance model, while having had a number of teething troubles on its way in, is a pretty good one to look at to see if that can be replicated elsewhere. I think it needs some development. It's not fully mature, but in principle, it's providing both the clinical community and manufacturers the sort of early stage feedback which should allow you to head off problems earlier, or indeed see opportunities for improvement earlier, if you like, as perhaps two sides of the same coin.
But if there's an appetite amongst manufacturers, as opposed to just a willingness to go along with something,
Yes.
an actual appetite, which I think is what you're saying, that there is,
Yes.
then combined with your own appetite for that to happen and similar feeling amongst the relevant clinical bodies, then it ought to be possible to make it happen very quickly. Is that right?
It ought to be, and the UK is in a position to be a world leader in that, because I don't think regulators worldwide are going to prescribe local data, but the manufacturers who are producing products for the world generally will need to find the data that's going to support their regulatory submissions worldwide, and I think there are opportunities around that for the UK to show a lead.
May I add to that too, because just quickly building on what Hudson asked me if I'd like to comment, and in terms of the experience that we've had in the area of medicines in proactively studying safety once a product's in wide use, that can be extended to the device world, and in order to, I think, perhaps have a leapfrog effect, you can have a very large advance in perhaps a shorter space of time than it's taken medicines. The Innovative Medicines Initiative that's funding the work on the integration of data with us at the moment, the application program interface work, has accepted that devices should be part of this. So I think it's all telling you that you're absolutely right. The industry is beginning to realise that public health protection should span these different worlds of medicines and devices and build on the very best.
Can I just ask you, thinking about the industry, we talk about it as the industry, but of course it's different companies. And those companies are in competition with each other, and they are concerned about their share prices and all the things that goes with the private sector. I'm just wondering, we were talking about how useful they may find data in terms of the robustness, the acceptability, whatever, of their products. But if they get that data, is there any requirement, do you think, in the future that they should make it public? Because one of the issues that we've heard from patient groups is the secretiveness of the manufacturing industry. And personally, I've had an experience with that. I've actually just trying to go into one of their, with permission, one of their sites, and it's like going into Fort Knox. They are very worried about people who are not part of the company actually coming onto the site. So I'm just wondering, if we do, as we're hoping to do with data and possibly later on registry, etc., but with the data, if the data is shared with the manufacturers, do you not think that they should make that data public as it is influencing their marketing potential?
May I pick this up? Yes, absolutely. I think what should happen, I mean, we have this policy in relation to clinical practice research data link, which we have within the agency, that studies done on it have to go through approvals through our independent scientific advisory committee. We publish which studies have been approved, and then there's an obligation to publish the study at the end. I think the owners of the database, if companies want access to that data, should be agreeing that any studies done on that data should be published, and I think that's the way to handle it.
I think people would be very reassured about that, actually. Right. Any more?
Yes. Can I ask you, if the MHRA had to recall a mesh product, could you do it? How would you do it?
Well, how do we record? We could revoke a CE mark product and communicate. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we have the powers to take products off the market if we feel there's a significant public health risk. And when we do that, we do it on behalf of the whole of Europe. So that can, by necessity, make it a somewhat interesting process if other parts of the system don't agree with your assessment of the risk associated with it. But we have the powers to take a product off the market. There are recalls taking place on a regular basis as part of the routine workings of the regulatory system. There are batch-related product problems and such like, which will generally be executed by the manufacturer, and in fact most of the regulatory action is executed by the manufacturer, because they understand their obligations and they do it. We will.
So you tell them that a particular mesh now it has to be recalled.
If we have the power to persuade manufacturers to take products off the market, in which case they take it off. We have the power to force them to take it off, which is a slightly different legal process. But if the product's taken off the market, typically we will issue a medical device alert and galvanise the system to freeze inventory. Clearly, recalling products that have been implanted already is a different matter. So I think there's then a series of, and we saw this with, if you like, the guidance around metal-on-metal hips. There's what you have to take very serious considerations of what's in the best interest of the patient for the next step for an implanted product. So you're not going to say, well, everybody has to have their mesh removed and replaced, because clearly that needs very
part of the issue being able to make that decision is locating where the mesh has been implanted in which patient and where they are. Of course, without the unique UDI at the moment, it's just the practicalities of how that would happen.
Well, UDI in conjunction with scan for safety are the keys to, if you like, a Pandora's box of information in the future, which will help us to manage these things.
Well, that's
and
the future.
They're rather, well, it's beginning to happen. We've got scan for safety, we've got UDI compliant barcodes on most of the high-risk products now. So that data is happening. It needs to be implemented in a more consistent manner, and we need the data sets to be designed so that they can be interrogated effectively. So I think we're well down the road, but we have still a long way to go.
But if you had to recall a product that was already implanted, where we're pre-UDI world, we're pre-scan for safety, can it actually be done? Can those patients be located, found, brought in, had a consultation? Can any of that happen? It
can and does happen, but it can be very clunky, and you can have no guarantee that every patient.
I think I was asking, can you do it for mesh?
Exactly, I'm asking if we do it mesh.
The probability is I would imagine not easily with mesh. With things like a heart valve or a pacemaker, I suspect the recording of the particular products and the linkage to the patient, even with paper records, is more comprehensive than it would be for mesh.
I think the other thing, though, I mean, part of a consideration to recall a product is what do you do with the patients who've got it implanted.
Sure.
And a lot of the circumstances would be we don't put any more in, but the risks and benefits of removing a product that's already in and is functioning, appears to be functioning well, it would be quite different to not implanting a new one. So I mean, that's part of the risk consideration at the time when the decision is taken whether to recall a product or not.
It's just that there's a practical issue before that, which I think you just covered, which is that you just can't. It's not possible in the case of mesh to locate those people who've had it.
I can't answer the question until you try, and I think it will be very variable. I think you'll find certain hospital trusts have excellent record keeping and have historically collected the sort of data that's required. Others possibly not. I don't know is the answer. We have a previous experience from the PIP breast implant issue, where it took a long time to reconcile.
When you force a company to take their product off the market,
yes,
presumably there's some sort of an appeal by the manufacturers for what you're doing for taking it off the market. And are there issues where the manufacturer would actually take you to court? Would there be legal implications in this? And would there be compensation?
It's very rare for manufacturers to challenge decisions that regulators make on the medical device side, and particularly in Europe, we've tried to take these actions in conjunction with our peers around Europe, which makes it more challenging. Generally, the data speaks for itself. Ultimately, if a decision is made and the the manufacturer wants to challenge it, the only record there are national authorities like ours have a process where they can appeal it locally, but ultimately under current legislation it has to go to the European Court of Justice for a decision. There is nothing in between. So there are local sort of appeal mechanisms which are more or less robust, not particularly legally sound, if you like, but very little between there and the European Court of Justice would be my interpretation of the current system.
And post Brexit.
I mean, we do, perhaps a bit more on the medicine side, we do end up in court sometimes with companies who do want judicial reviews against our decisions that we've taken. That is a fact of life. Not very common, but it does happen from time to time.
Right. Any other questions?
On another question, in terms of sort of pharmacovigilance, we are currently part of the EU. We currently operate a decentralised pharmacovigilance system. I guess the next bit, what's going to happen?
Are you talking medicines or devices or both?
Medicines and devices.
Do you want to?
Well, I think we can be confident that actually what we do nationally will, largely speaking, continue. And I think in terms of preserving powers for urgent action, they will be there. We're talking in a way of slightly easier decisions than urgent action on a device. You can suspend, revoke, compulsorily vary, and urgent action will always be capable of being justified. And I don't think in terms of legal action, it's been more than once in my professional career that a scientific question has been asked. For the future,
our pharmacovigilance capability, because we're a much smaller population in terms
we
of
will
numbers.
continue to use all data sources from any parts of the world, and we've got not just our European network where we're planning and hoping to be partners, but international through the WHO and close relationships with FDA, TGA, Health Canada and so on. So pharmacovigilance is truly sans frontières. It is a global function, and it's even such that a new flu vaccine being tested in Australia, our children will benefit from the knowledge that we get immediately simply because their flu season is a bit earlier. So it is an international function, but no one is complacent. And clearly the hope is for a close partnership to continue. Nonetheless, I think we're absolutely ready to make our decisions for our people in good time if that's not to be achieved.
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate the government's preferred position is continued participation in the European system. Clearly that will need to be negotiated, but that is the preferred position of the government. But do you want to comment on the vigilance side?
Yeah, I mean, in devices, the vigilance processes are less evolved than in medicines, and the level of collaboration and pooling of data is nowhere near at the level it's been on the medicine side. Equally, we do have well-established global communication systems, and I've said many times to people, if there's a public health problem, post-Brexit, whatever circumstances, I'm still going to phone up my peer in Germany and France and ask them one for help, and if we can help them. I think the community of regulators who around the world will be disrupted in terms of our access to formal data channels, but we will continue to exchange information. So it's not ideal, but it's far from disastrous, I would say.
I hope we were going to have a Brexit-free zone this afternoon, but there we go. I mean, it is a huge, huge issue, of course. Simon, any questions?
Well, I just have one other question, really, which is this morning, I think, when you made your opening remarks, you talked about MHRA's support for safe innovation, and there's obviously a natural tension between those two. Which I think represents a challenge for everyone in the future, and it's something that everyone in the system and beyond the system needs to be thinking about, including patients. I suppose the question in relation to mesh is whether, looking back as we sit here today, you would say that mesh was a safe intervention and an innovative safe intervention.
Well, I think, again, a new product being put on the market now, you need to, the need for the product in terms of the clinical need, the current treatment options, because I think the gynecological surgery in itself has moved on a long way from when mesh was introduced. Mesh was introduced because of a high failure rate of existing procedures, but that's moved on. So I think you've got to look at everything in the context of where you are when you're introducing it. What I think we've touched on this a number of times. What I'd like to see is, I mean, clearly we'll have for new products coming along and the new regulations, a larger clinical package, more monitoring put in place in terms of the post-marketing follow-up commitment, etc. I'd like to see the health service doing its part in terms of thinking about early guidance in terms of how to introduce this in a safe way, the beyond compliance, scan for safety, all of that, data sources to be able to monitor it, and in an ideal world for me, you'll get all of that in place for new things coming in. You do always, as you alluded to, have to balance that. At what point is a reasonable point for a new product to be brought into for public use? Balancing what is known, what is not known, the degree of risk in the context of the condition that the patient is being treated for, and what's the need therefore. There's demands for urgent treatments in high unmet medical need type circumstances. So you've always got to have that balance as what's the right time. We don't want to hold up innovation where there'll be a clear benefit to patients. On the other hand, we want to do it safely such that you get the right balance of what's known before, but monitor very carefully afterwards. And full openness, of course, as we talked about earlier, in relation to what's known and what's not known.
In that future world, openness, will we ever get to a place where we have a central database that shows all the CE-approved products that are on the market?
I hope so. We should have that.
UDMED 2 is in construction. Like all public sector IT projects, it's not easy, particularly at a European level. But the design and the intent is there. When it will arrive in completion, I don't know. But I think it's the intent's right, and the components, if they deliver, will help us greatly because we will know what's on the market, which at the moment we don't.
It's been under discussion for years.
It has.
And years. And it still isn't there. I mean, when do we have an expected sort of date when it will go live?
Well, the legislation interestingly includes a paragraph around what happens if it's not there. So I think there was an assumption that elements of it would be laid. And I think to be fair to the Commission and the people who are developing it, it is a mammoth exercise, but it needs to be completed. I don't imagine it will be completed on the dot in 2020 when the legislation has to be implemented, but hopefully major components of it will be, and it will be completed within a reasonable time frame, whatever that may be.
Right. Now it's up to you. Are there any questions you'd like to ask of us?
I don't think I've got any questions for you. Clearly what we've spoken about today, the hugely important issue of making sure that across the system ourselves, everyone across the system listen to patients much more, that we also the second issue really about joining up the system to make sure the system is responsive when things go wrong and how we do that and the levers to pull. And the third area is a real push for better data, better monitoring, etc. I think those are the three key areas for me in the areas we've been talking about into the review.
Right. Well, thank you so much.